Welcome to Lowriders. It's another workshop on the whiteboard, and it's about 2 in the morning, so bear with me for a little bit. But we are going to talk about, this is a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a while now. I don't think it's discussed quite enough. Dual narratives. So what are dual narratives? It's two separate narratives that are focused on sort of a central theme, plot, idea, or story, but they stand on their own two legs. It's not an A and a B story because a B story can only exist with an A story. But dual narratives, they don't need each other to exist. They can exist on their own. And usually, essentially, dual narratives are technically like two movies in one. So I'm going to give a few examples of movies that do this and do it really well. One of the things, too, is that dual narratives can be confused a little bit with like flashbacks. Because especially if you have dual narrative script and movie that is taking place where one narrative is in a different time period versus another, it can feel like you're just doing flashbacks, but you're not. So you have to be very particular and specific with how you introduce the second narrative so it doesn't really get confused for a flashback. So that's kind of like the main thing to take into your noggin right now. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So what is a dual narrative, right? What is a dual narrative? My writing is horrible right now, but you can kind of see that. What is a dual narrative? That looks like chicken scratch. So let me redo that. Okay, let me redo that really quick. I want to make sure y'all can really read. Okay. What, there we go, is a dual that looks a lot better. There we go. What is a dual narrative? Okay. So what is a dual narrative? So it is two narratives from two perspectives. All right. So that's like the first one. Now, the perspectives don't necessarily have to be specifically from a person. It can be two perspectives of like an ideology or a theme or a time period. Because essentially you are kind of telling the same story. And you have to also remember your audience is on the outside looking in. But essentially you can make it very POV, like the point of view of like one character versus another, especially if it's a story that is a conflict story. So like if you have two characters that own a business and the business falls apart, you have this narrative, their version of the narrative, and then their version of the narrative. So you're going to get direct POVs while you may have just, and we'll see in the examples that I bring up, narratives that kind of take place in like two different places, like actual physical places or time periods, or at the same time, but it's sort of like the characters are experiencing it not like interlinked with each other. I don't know if that makes any sense, but hopefully it does later on when we kind of break it down more. So two narratives from two perspectives. Now the narratives though, it's the same plot, and I'm going to use plot with like quotations, okay? And we'll get to that later. This is just information, so it's going to be a lot easier to absorb and to like, it's not going to sound so jumbled for me when I actually bring the examples. Now, the other thing is It's not flashbacks. So obviously, if you have a character that, one of the main narratives is today, takes place today, and then the second narrative takes place a week ago. Obviously, we're going to go back to a week ago. It's not flashbacks. You have to be very deliberate in what you do and how you implement that, because you don't want a lot of criticism from like readers or producers is there's too many flashbacks or whatever. So you have to make sure that when you do a dual narrative, that second narrative or that first narrative, however it works out, is very, very distinguished. Like, people understand this is an entirely separate narrative that we have to pay attention to. It's not just flashbacks or a B story. The other thing that a dual narrative is, that's what I was looking for. Both the narratives are self-reliant. So this goes back to A and the B story. B story is totally reliant on the A story. The A story doesn't need the B story per se, but it can. Oftentimes the A story doesn't rely, but it sort of like requests a B story in order to like help enhance it. The thing about a dual narrative is both stories don't need each other. If you were to just make a movie on this one, it would totally work out just as if you were to make a movie on this one. So that's the thing. Two narratives from two perspectives, same plot, that's focused on the same plot. Obviously, not flashbacks. It's not just a series of flashbacks. You have to make sure not to make the mistake. And both narratives are self-reliant. Okay? It's the best way I can kind of like simplify it down. All right, so let's get into it. This doesn't need to be like an hour, hour and a half, so the first one is probably the most obvious one, and there's actually going to be, I'm going to do two. So the first example is going to consist of two films. So we have, was I going to put an A there? Oh my God. Been listening to too much West Side Gun. The Godfather 2. And then the second one, there's some pretty distinct similarities between these two, but also very, very different. Blue Valentine. Okay? So the Godfather, the dual narrative here is, we have narrative one, Michael Corleone, rise in mafia. And then the second one is Vito Corleone. What do they call it? Not rise in the mafia, because he's kind of, well, his is the rise because he becomes the Godfather, and then it's just him like rising, like as a mafioso, as a Godfather, to attaining more power. And Vito Corleone, the second one, is him becoming Godfather to an extent. So this one also takes place in the main timeline, which is off of the first Godfather, which is like in the 70s or something like that. I can't remember the exact timeline, but that's when the movie came out. And then this one is historical. So it takes place like 30, 40 years before the events of this. So this goes back to the thing of like, in a lesser, more craftier screenplay, they would have just had a few, like 2 or 3 flashbacks of Vito Corleone slowly becoming a criminal and then becoming a Godfather, just to kind of like, I don't know, kill time, or just like, oh, look at, like, he's becoming like his father. But they literally spend equal time with both these narratives. They're their own narratives, okay? And they focus generally on the same plot, which is how Michael Corleone and Vito Corleone acquired, how they had to evolve as criminals and acquire power. So obviously with Michael Corleone, he was already a godfather by the start of this one. So it's his further rise and evolution. And then Vito Corleone, he's not at any way involved in the mafia. And then slowly but surely, when he comes to America, how he evolves and embeds himself in that lifestyle. And both of them work separately perfectly fine by themselves. And they don't rely on each other, but it just creates such a alternate experience and perspective on not only the way that both Corleones had to um, evolve in the reality of what they were in, and it provides a different perspective of the audience to realize like the inevitability of what their destiny was. Vito Corleone coming to America, it was inevitable at some point that he was going to have to kind of become a criminal in order to really survive and provide for his family the way that he wanted to. And for Michael Corleone, even though he was in the military and he didn't really want anything to do with his mafia family in that regard, he realized that it's inevitable. Like you just can't. Like he's too close to it. And at a certain point, in order for his family to survive, for their mafia, family to survive, he's going to have to take the lead. Otherwise, they're all done for. So that's like that's probably one of the best examples, the easiest examples in my opinion, to look at a dual storyline and really see how it works on screen. And then also, if you're able to read the script, you can do that as well. Blue Valentine does a similar thing. The first storyline, so obviously it's Ryan Gosling and I can't remember her name, I'm so sorry, but she's a phenomenal actress. It's about their marriage dying. So it's falling apart. They're basically just struggling to survive, right? Second storyline is their love blossoming. And then this one takes place in, I'm going to just put modern timeline, just like I did for The Godfather. And this one is in the past. So they're like in their 40s at this point in the movie. And this is when they're like 20s, their early 20s. Obviously, they have a kid. They've been together for many years. And this one, they don't even know each other yet. So this film gives like a really, and again, at first you think you're having just like a flashback here and there, but then you realize like it supersedes the flashback trope. It's its own narrative. You're like, oh, it's not just a little flashback to see like, oh wow, look at how far they've fallen out of love. It's really just providing a much more it just gives you so much information on the characters, because if you have this one you can only assume so much, but then when you have this one it's like it becomes a much more richer and fuller picture. And I think that's kind of the words that I was looking for. And what's very interesting is you see how they fall in love and you see how they fall out of love. So I think the great thing about a dual storyline is that it doesn't really pick sides. That's the main thing. And it's not really there for you to feel, for the most part, like not so much conflicted, but just to be very clear of what the situation is and how things ended up the way they are. Because I don't think you can watch The Godfather 2 and feel like on Michael's side or on Vito's side, but you don't even really feel against them. You just have an understanding, like, oh, this is just what it is. This is what it happened. So it's the same thing with this. Like, it's very easy if you were to watch this to hate Ryan Gosling's character, but then when you see this narrative, when you get embedded in this narrative, you don't hate Ryan Gosling's character. You could probably you don't really ever hate his wife. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but it just provides you with such like I said, like a very complete, unapologetic picture of what the reality is between the entire plot and what I would say like what the message is, so to speak. So there's nothing that you can really miss in what the message is. With this one, I would say love is complicated, and another one in this one, I would say the message you get is that like how much family plays a role in the overall outcome of who you want to be and who you are. So that is a good example of like two separate narratives at two different time periods and how they are isolated and they're relying on themselves, but also working together. They just enhance the overall experience. So there's that. Take a little screenshot maybe. Okay. I need to try to write bigger. Powering through this. I'm a little tired, so. And dual narrative is like something that doesn't get talked about as much. So it is kind of hard trying to figure out like the best way to communicate this. Hopefully my microphone didn't pick that up, but it probably did. All right, so the second example that I have is one of my favorite movies. It's a fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. Has my man crush here. One of my many man crushes. Jake Gyllenhaal, Nocturnal Animals, with Amy Adams, Isla Fisher, Armie Hammer, Mr. Cannibal. So the way that Nocturnal Animals does a dual narrative is they have, how can I visualize this? Ooh, this is a good way to do it. So they have their main story, right? This is the main story. And then, damn, how do I visualize this? Maybe I don't need to visualize it. Actually, I have a really good way to visualize this. This is how we do it. This is actually perfect. So, Nocturnal Animals has the main story. And then what it does is it has a story within a story. Okay? So this main story on the outside here, this is focused on Jake Gyllenhaal and Amy Adams and how their romance flourished and kind of like occurred and happened, and then how it fell apart and how they, I don't want to spoil anything, but I'll say reconciled. So that's that story. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, is how this is linked to this story within the story, this narrative within this narrative, this dual narrative format. Jake Gyllenhaal's main character writes a novel, and he sends it to Amy Adams. They haven't talked to each other in years. And it's a novel that's getting published. And the novel is his interpretation of their relationship that fell apart 20 years ago when they were in college. And so in the movie, we go from seeing, Amy Adams reading the book and, their history together when they were in college to seeing the content of the book. So we go into like a crime genre. Like it literally goes into like a crime thriller genre because as she's reading the book, we're seeing what's happening. It's violent, it's brutal, and Jake Gyllenhaal plays the character in the book that we're seeing. So it's a really nice, creative way to do this. And so we're seeing how it actually happened in the very like non-dramatic way, and then we're seeing the fictionalized, dramatized version where everything that happens in the book is Jake Gyllenhaal's character's way of creatively expressing this, like how it made him feel, like the rage, like certain thing that happened in the main story, in the real life version of their romance, was something very devastating. And the way he articulated it in the book when she was reading it, it was very violent. Like to him, it felt like something violently was snatched from him. And so that's like his perspective, while we're kind of getting more her perspective, which is a little less dramatic and less vicious. But it's vicious on an inwardly emotional, while this is viciously outwardly primarily, and then obviously inwardly. So it's a story within a story. The main story of Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal, they're, meeting in college, falling apart, doesn't talk for 20 years. She gets a book, a manuscript of a book that he wrote that's going to get published. She reads the manuscript, and then we go into the book, and that's a separate like movie of what we're seeing in the book. Super. I mean, I love this movie so much. It's done by Tom Ford. Yes, the fashion designer. So, but that's another way to do a dual narrative, is like a story within a story. You could say that like The Princess Bride is like this, but it's not really. It's more of like a framing device. Like it's the, I think it's the grandfather, right? That, tells the story of The Princess Bride or whatever. And then we see The Princess Bride. There's not really a narrative happening with the child and the grandfather. Sorry if it's his dad, but I'm pretty sure it's his grandfather. I haven't seen that movie in forever. And so there's not really a narrative. It's just a framing device. And, it's like really the story that he's telling and that we're seeing of The Princess Bride. It's like that can survive on its own, but it doesn't really work without the framing device of the storytelling of, at the bedside type thing, and vice versa. So that's how I was kind of saying it can get kind of dicey. It can get kind of confusing. It can kind of make sure, well, isn't it the same thing? But ultimately, if you just made a movie just with that, without the introduction of, or without the knowledge, I should say, of the narrative with Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal through college and all that, it would stand on its own. And vice versa, this stands on its own as well. Like there's a lot of information going on to where that narrative is totally in and of itself. Okay, and I think that's sort of the main thing, is that like with The Princess Bride, those two things rely on each other very heavily. You don't get the same effect. And I get it. You could say you don't get the same effect, but the effect just enhances. Like it was never fully reliant on it. With The Princess Bride, that they were both fully reliant on each other from the start. Okay. So hopefully that's not super, super confusing. I know writing can get very fucking annoying. Trust me, I'm very aware of that. So just kind of take a picture of that screenshot. Okay. Now, the last one is a little bit more dicier because it does fall into the trap of like flashbacks. And you could make the argument that, they're not really like self-reliant, so to speak. But I say when you really look and watch the film, it is generally two narratives. And the reason why is because you have to make a distinction that really establishes and communicates to the audience that you are seeing two separate narratives. And that movie, it's not that exciting in terms of, I'm trying to make it act like it's a big deal. Memento, one of my favorite movies too. Often people can still consider this Christopher Nolan's best film. So, sorry about that. So with Memento, you technically kind of have like the thing that's interesting about Nolan is that he plays with time a lot. Okay, he kind of fucks with you on time. So Memento obviously is about the character who has short-term memory due to a blunt force trauma to the head. His wife was murdered. So he's trying to find out who killed his wife, but because of his short-term memory, he has to write notes. And part of his note writing process is he tattoos the most important information on his body. So he can like look and be like, don't trust Teddy, So that's like something he will always forget. He won't lose that note. And so the movie is him going through this thing of like getting information, forgetting it, re-remembering it, having to meet certain people and having certain like tests that he knows that he's met them before and all that. It's an incredibly intelligent movie. Very well done. I mean, it's excellent. If you haven't seen it, see it. Okay, so that's kind of the first one. The first narrative is basically it's a detective. All right. And it's the plot, the story is, or the perspective, so to speak, is the main character through his amnesia. We'll put amnesia here. So you're getting this perspective of like constantly having to try to remember and figure things out with him. It's a whole experience of like, okay, don't trust Teddy, don't do this and that, meeting people. And like, obviously as an audience, you're going to have a little bit more information than the main character, but for the most part, it's the perspective is like this crippling amnesia that he has, this short-term memory where it's like you have to constantly just be in this exhausting sort of like be exhaustingly present in what's going on so that he doesn't get manipulated and that he can continue to make progress in finding out who killed his wife. Okay. Now the second one comes off as flashbacks, but this is the thing. The second narrative is about, I would say it's more like a drama. It's not so much detective because he's not really trying to figure anything out. It is a drama. And it's very clear in terms of like what's going, like there's no, like the amnesia thing is there obviously, but what's going on in this particular narrative is a lot more clear, a lot more linear. There's no like jumping around in time. And the thing here is that it's in black and white. So you don't really know if it's a flashback or not. All that you know is that it's its own thing and you have to really pay attention to it. Like obviously you're going to always pay attention to stuff in movies, but you're going to separate yourself from what you're seeing in the main narrative, or not main, in the first narrative. You're, as an audience, you're already saying, okay, I have to like not forget, but I have to like put this off to the side and really focus on this. You don't have to connect the two. And that kind of goes with the self-reliant thing too, because this by itself, what we're seeing here is him in a motel room actually, on the phone with somebody talking to him. And that's the whole narrative until the very end when it's like, oh, things really unravel and kind of come crashing ahead. But the whole time he's just in a motel room talking on the phone to we don't know who. And he's very clear. His amnesia isn't really active at this point. He's remembering things, and what we're getting is a very linear information. We're not having to go through any type of trickery or figuring things out or question our own memory. And that's a very distinct thing. And ultimately what happens is that these are actually, if I believe I'm correct, they're pretty much in the same time period. Like they're not really, this one's not like a year ago or whatever. As far as I remember, I'm pretty sure. But essentially they're kind of taking place at the same time. But also it doesn't really matter when they take place because it's just sort of like, oh, okay, like what you're getting from here is a completely different experience on the perspective of how he sees the situation that he's dealing with here. Because obviously with this one, it's very proactive. It has a lot of action going on. It's not very reflective. But this one, he's sort of reflecting a lot on what he's experiencing here. So it's a very interesting way to get literally two different perspectives from the same person. And I think that is what is most skillful about Memento and the way it kind of utilizes, not kind of, the way it does utilize dual narratives. Okay? So just kind of take a peek at that. Again, past 2 a.m. at this point, doing my best. But I always want to make sure to get these out at least once a month so people can have something to go off of. So, to kind of wrap up here, and I'm really glad this is not going like an hour like some of the other ones, and I don't think it needed to be. It's a lot more straightforward. So let's figure out a little bit of how we can implement dual narratives into our screenplays. Okay, so let me put how to do dual narrative. Right? Exclamation point, because we're excited. So the first thing is sort of the main rule. Two perspectives. So there has to be two perspectives that are going on regarding the plot and the storyline or the theme, however you want to word that. Obviously, with like Blue Valentine, the theme is like love. And we don't really get two perspectives in terms of the characters. Like, we don't really get Ryan Gosling's character and then the co-star's character. It's more or less like the two perspectives of the time in which they are in love. The end of their love when it's falling apart, and the beginning when it was flourishing. So we get those two perspectives, and so we get two complete pictures of those characters. With The Godfather, we get two different time periods from two literally different people, Michael Corleone and Vito Corleone. And they have the same experience of just evolving and rising in the ranks of like the criminal world, but two different time periods and two different circumstances in which they were in. Vito Corleone was coming from Italy into America poor. Michael Corleone, the family was already established, and it was about maintaining and having to compromise those morals and those ethics for much different reasons than his father. But you kind of see like those two perspectives and how, in many ways, like again, the inevitability of like they are victims of their circumstances, so to speak. So that's a really good thing. And then obviously with Nocturnal Animals, the perspective was kind of like objective versus subjective. So the objective was like the first narrative where Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal, it's like who they are in the real life of high school or college sweethearts, marriage, divorce, everything. She went off to marry somebody else, didn't speak to each other for 20 years, got reconnected and had their reconciliation. I don't want to spoil anything. And then that's like a very objective. And obviously, regardless of how objective it is, you can come up with your own like subjective attitude and judgments towards the characters, but let's say objective. Then it went into the literal subjective interpretation of that part of their relationship that fell apart from Jake Gyllenhaal's character with his novel. And then, of course, Memento, the perspectives are more ethereal, where it's like we're experiencing something with the main character from a more like in real time, so to speak, or in an environment where it's like chaotic and we're, in a different kind of genre, like a very detective type genre. And then we're seeing the same character and we're seeing him engage with sort of like, in that narrative, engage in a more calm, clear way that's not detective, it's more static. And so we just get a whole different, we get those two perspectives on what is going on with his situation of him trying to find his wife. And even just experience wise, it's done in black and white. It's just like a whole different tone. So the other thing, so you have to establish that, like, okay, what's the real perspective that I'm giving here? Second thing is the structure. As we talked about, you have literally just two straight up narratives from two different time periods, which just seems to work with The Godfather and Blue Valentine, right? Then we have the story within the story, which is what the Nocturnal Animals did. And then with Memento, we have, it's essentially taking place in the same time period, whether it's within the same week. Maybe the first narrative is like Monday, the second narrative is Tuesday or Wednesday, but essentially it's like, it's very close to each other. But it's the tone and the feel is very different, and the characters in terms of how the character themselves is sort of engaging with the plot is very different also. Memento's Memento's kind of like an unfair way to compare to introduce to that introduce to this workshop as like an example because it's done so masterfully, and I don't think many people could pull it off like Christopher Nolan could. So you have to figure out the structure. Two separate storylines, story within a story, or something that's a little bit more creative and risky. Um, and obviously with Memento using the black and white. So the third thing is I think for the main thing, and this is really tricky, the characters remain the same. So what I mean by that is not necessarily lack of character development, but regardless of the different perspectives and how you structure it, it doesn't really change your mind about the characters. Like, they don't go from evil to bad or bad to evil. They're essentially still the same person. Like in Nocturnal Animals, like Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal, like nothing's really changed about them, who they are at the core. It's just you just have like a deeper understanding, and you just get a better fulfillment of like what their thought process and decision making was, like what went on behind it. So I think that's really the main thing, is that when you have the two narratives, like you're not really trying to you're giving a different experience, but it's like you're not really trying to change the characters. It's a really nuanced way of doing it. And so I'm trying to think of something maybe off the top of my head that I could use, is like, besides the ones I just gave. So it's like yeah, like if you have like two people like from on a sports drama, like side A and side B, like team A and team B, and you have the whole narrative from this particular team and how they perceive this team as like assholes, and then you have this dual narrative, the second narrative of them perceiving it and they perceive them as assholes. So it's like you don't really, their version doesn't invalidate their version and vice versa. So as an audience member, you don't really see the characters as change. It's just like you have a better understanding, like, oh yeah, like in this one they did come off as assholes, but they're not really assholes, but I could see how in this one they came off as assholes. So it's like I don't, like, nothing about them really changed. It's just like your understanding of the perspective. Okay. And then I would say one more thing, how to do a dual narrative is, so have very two distinct perspectives, figure out your structure, understand that the characters are essentially remaining the same. There's not, because it kind of defeats the point a little bit too. If you're going to have a dual narrative and then they just change so dramatically, it's like you might as well just figure out a way to make it one narrative. And the fourth thing is, it's very audience driven. Obviously, every screenplay is audience driven to an extent, but this one I think is the most, because you are asking a lot for the audience to absorb two separate narratives. I think with The Godfather, it was considered a very big risk and a very like ballsy move, because it's also essentially to where you could have just been like, why don't we just make the third Godfather about a prequel where Vito Corleone becomes, a criminal. But so when you decide, okay, I'm going to do a dual narrative, you don't just want to have just two movies in one. That's just kind of like it does, like you have to ask yourself, like, what am I going to do to really have the audience accept what I'm giving them, accept this, like, oh, it's basically two movies. Because if it's one thing to have one narrative, focused on one narrative in a film, to have two narratives that you're focused on, they both have to be good. So they both have to be good, and they both have to be really mindful of the audience and what you're asking of them, and to make sure that when you do this, that it's really worth their time. Okay. So that's another thing you really, really have to take into consideration. It's very much audience driven, and part of that is being mindful of the fact that if you're going to do dual narrative, you can't do something that's like 120 pages and 80 to 90 pages only on the first narrative, and the second narrative just gets like 30 or 40 pages. It doesn't work that way. You have to be considerate of the audience. You have to be considerate, obviously, of storytelling, common sense. So just take a little screenshot of that. Cool. Just going to end it really quick with this. Dual narratives is like, when I was looking all this stuff up, it was like really, really difficult to figure out how I could like communicate all this in a way that doesn't sound like jumbled and convoluted, or like I'm just like talking out of my ass. It's actually one of the harder workshops that I had to do. And I want to do this maybe in person with like a group of people to get something and live stream it, or like record it and put it up on the channel, because I think dual narratives, again, is not something that is talked about at in depth enough. So what we're going to do, just to kind of close it out, is I'm going to do some visualizations, right? So what we're going to have here is the 3 different dual narratives. So we have this first one where it's like the different timelines, right? So think of it, I know this is kind of dumb. Think of it as like 2 people that have the same story, just kind of telling each other their story. And it's the same story, but the fact that it's 2 different perspectives provides just so much more full and richer thing, okay? Now, this one, the story within the story, so let's, okay, or actually, no, that's actually, I'm going to do this. All right. So the story within the story, think of it as like a person that's telling you what's inside this box that's closed. And then later on, you get to actually like open the box and see what's inside it, and see like, oh, everything that they told me was like what it is, but actually seeing the contents of like the more raw version, it's like I understand even more now, like what they mean, or maybe their interpretation. I can see why they interpret it this way, but you know, it just provides a whole lot more like tangible feeling, more raw, visceral, right? Now, the last one is like the Memento one, where it's like a distinct sort of thing. Now, this is the way I'm gonna visualize it. So let's have like a door, right? So I'm not gonna put a doorknob. Oh, you know what I'll do? This is not the easiest way to draw a door, but so like it's open. This is like, you know. So imagine somebody, how am I going to draw them? Door open, inside there. So you're going to have somebody like the main character in Memento. How do I do this? They're going to walk inside this door, right? Then they're going to come out, and they're going to tell you what they saw in there, okay? And then later on, they're going to go back inside that doorway. They're going to come back out, and they're going to tell you what they saw again, but it's going to be different, because they're going to notice things that they didn't notice before, or they're going to have a different, like, not interpretation, but the way they're going to see certain items, they're going to see it differently. And so when they come back out, they're going to tell you the same, essentially they're going to describe the same room, but in a different way. So that's kind of what Memento does. It tells the same story from the same person, from the same perspective, but in a different way, because one of it's he's actively being a detective, and then the second one he's just literally on a phone call with somebody else. So think of that as like the third way to like do a dual narrative, where somebody goes in and out. And another off the top of my head that I just came up with that is a really good example of a dual narrative is that does exactly this is True Detective. So that's another really good example. Something happens, they have their story, years later they retell that story again, but it's like they have a different feeling and interpretation of it, so to speak. So visually, think of those like two, dual narratives in these visuals. Literally, two people that have the same story that are talking to each other, and they both have their own experiences with it, and it just kind of like enhances like sort of the parallels, obviously. Then you have the story within the story. Somebody's telling you what's inside the box, but then you actually get to see what's inside the box, and it is what they tell you, but it's just being able to touch it and feel it. It feels more raw. It gives a different experience. And then like the True Detective and Memento version, it's like somebody walks in a room, they walk out, they describe it to you, and then sometime later they go back in that room again, come out, re-describe it to you, and it's the same room, but it's just a different experience with how they tell it to you the second time around. So hopefully that's not too convoluted. This was like a workshop that I was like kind of dreading a bit because it was so like not difficult. It was just like, man, this is like explaining dual narrative is like so simple, but yet it's like trying to actually make it tangible is like very difficult. And you can really run into the problem where it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about, but ultimately it's just a difficult thing to really communicate in a way that doesn't sound like it's too convoluted, or that it's contradicting itself, or if it's being overly complicated or too simple. It's difficult. So thank you for like bearing with me through this. This was actually one of the tougher ones, and hopefully it was very helpful in some type of way. I will be doing another whiteboard workshop in like a month, and then I plan to do a in-person workshop, maybe of like 6 to 10 people in January. Also going to have shirts and hats that are going to be available that I am going to be selling in person at the Miller's Trading Post in Los Angeles sometime in January, February at the latest. So thank you for sticking with this for 40 some odd minutes. I am tired and I'm ready to go to sleep. So have a good one, and I'll see you next time.